Welcome to a very special episode of IMS Radio. One of my most favorite things we've ever done with IMS Radio. We're going to be doing the all-time Maryland Terrapins football team, and who better to do that with than Coach Ralph Friedgen. How you doing, Coach?
Doing real good, Larry. How are you?
I'm great having you here with us. I decided I wanted to do this project a little while ago, and I spent 3 to 4 weeks collecting data, going everywhere I could over the internet, umterps.com, on College Football Reference, and I asked Coach, would you be willing to do this with me? And unbelievably, you said yes. And not only did you say yes, you said, if we're going to do this, we're going to do it right. And so we have spent a lot of time going through the data, analyzing, moving people around, and it's been a lot of fun. So I'm really excited to get to all the selections we've made.
You know, Larry, it's never going to be easy.
It's never going to be so many good players. Yeah.
A lot of these are very tough decisions to make, especially
Right.
when you're considering different eras and different styles of football and different coaches. So we did the best we could. So hopefully it'll be good enough.
Yeah, but that's also what makes it interesting, right? Comparing someone from the 50s who has a low number of stats, or sometimes I couldn't even find the stats because they didn't collect it all very well back then. You compare it with a statistical monster from the 2000s with someone who has accolades from the 50s, or like the great teams in the 80s, and that's what makes it fun. It's what makes it interesting, and I'm sure those are going to be some picks that some people disagree with, but who better to do that, to make those picks, than someone who grew up watching some of the teams in the 50s, played for Maryland in the 60s, was a graduate assistant in the 60s into the 70s, coached at Maryland in the 80s under Bobby Ross, then coached against Maryland twice at 2 different stints with Georgia Tech in the 90s. Obviously, the head coach from 2001 to 2010, coached against Maryland again in the teens with Rutgers, and still closely associated with Mike Locksley, your good friends. No one could be better for this project than someone who's been around the team for 70 years, Coach.
You make me feel so young, Larry.
Yeah, I know. But all that experience is awesome. And through the process, you've been telling some stories. I cannot wait for people to hear those stories. And so without further ado, let's get to those stories. We're going to do 2 position groups per episode, 5 episodes. And in this episode, we're going to be doing quarterbacks and running backs. So we're going to start with the quarterbacks. And right off the bat, we're going to go to our first team quarterback, Jack Scarbath. He played with the Terrapins from 1950 to 1952. He's 24-4-1 as a starter. The Heisman runner-up in 1952. Can you imagine someone from today finishing second in the Heisman? That'd be insane. First-team All-American. He's in the College Football Hall of Fame, the number 3 overall pick in the NFL draft. What do you think about Jack Scarbath, Coach?
Well, I know Jack, and he was just a wonderful person also. But, when you're a quarterback, to me, the big stat is how many games did you win? He's 24-4-1,
right.
And played under Coach Tatum, and but he was involved in Maryland football for a long time. I first got to know him back in the '60s, and then when Coach Claiborne came in, he was a very big part of hiring Coach Claiborne and Coach Ross. So he was a very influential guy, and I'm sure he's missed at Maryland because he was a great Terp.
Yeah, and like we were talking about, the statistics with Jack, I could barely find any. I think he had less than 1,000 passing yards because they ran a lot more back then, and there was way fewer games. There were fewer plays per game. All of that kind of stuff adds up to way lower numbers, but hard to argue with those accolades. They didn't win the championship with him. We'll get to that
But they
person
were
in a
ranked very high. They were ranked
Yeah.
top 10,
Right.
those times. So, you only could compare people to their peers.
Right.
He was outstanding with his peers. So I definitely think you have to consider him. And I don't know
Right.
where to put him other than I think he has probably the best stats of all the quarterbacks as far as his winning percentage,
Right. Yeah. And if the rules were different back then, he would have been the one to win the national championship in 1951, but they awarded it after the regular season back then. The 51 team went on to beat the number 1 team in the bowl game and would have would have been the national championship. 1953 would have been reversed. They would have lost it, but it is what it is. That's the way they did it back then. Let's go to number 2, Boomer Esiason, one of the most iconic Terps of all time. He has had obviously the great career after Maryland as well, but he played for the Terps from 81 to 83. He holds 17 school records. Again, think about that. In the 80s, there was more passing, but still not as much as there is today. But he still holds 17 school records. He was on the ACC 50th anniversary team, 2-time honorable mention All-American, didn't quite make the All-American teams. They did title with him in 83, number 38 overall pick in the draft, and oddly enough, did not make any all conference teams. They only put out one team back then. And coach, you told me who was the guy from Duke that won it every
Ben,
year?
Ben Bennett won it, and
Yes.
Boomer came out in the papers after they named the announcement and said that Ben Bennett couldn't hold his jock, and I agree with him. He definitely he got hosed by the southern states of the ACC. But Boomer, when he came out with that statement, it was during I think we were playing the Tangerine Bowl against Tennessee, and I said to him, "Why would you make that statement, Boomer?" He says, the attendance is lacking for this game. I'm trying to juice it up a little bit." He always had his eye on the publicity. He was a great, when I got the opportunity to go to Maryland with Coach Ross, I called Coach Claiborne. I want to know if he had a quarterback. I really don't like to take jobs they don't have quarterbacks. And he said he only thought he had one quarterback, and that was Stan Gelbaugh. And then when I got there, we had Boomer, we had Frank Wright, we had Stan Gelbaugh. We ended up recruiting Neil O'Donnell, Scott Zolak. So it turned out pretty good. But, Boomer, under the years of Coach Claiborne, he didn't throw the ball a whole lot. And so when Coach Ross came in and we kind of put in a pro offense, and we threw the ball quite a bit. And I know I had this big discussion with Coach Ross about we wanted to convert a route to the wide field. And back then, the hash marks were a little wider than they are today. And I coached in 1AA, and I never had a kid that could make that throw. And so Bobby said to me, "Well, why don't we script it and we'll see who's right." And I remember Boomer, we threw the conversion, and he was the quarterback, and I heard the ball go through the air. And I turned to the coach, and I says, I guess you were right. We can do that, because even in pro ball, the hashes were a lot closer. So he had an unbelievable arm, and he made that throw against North Carolina. I think they were ranked 8th, and we played them at Maryland, and that was a great game. The place went nuts, and they came out of the stands and tore the goalposts down on that game too. But
Yeah.
definitely, definitely deserves to be that rating. Yes.
Yes. Boomer, number 2. Now we'll go on to our number 3 team, Bernie Filoni. And I know there's going to be some controversy here about not including Talia because of all the records he holds. We'll get to him in a minute. But it's hard to argue with these accolades from Bernie Filoni. 1951 to 1953, he was 10-1 as a starter. The 1953 national championship, the quarterback of the national championship team. He was a first-team All-American. He was ACC first team, the ACC Player of the Year in 53. He was 4th in the Heisman voting in 1953, a year after Jack Scorbath finished second. Just think about that. And of the 11th overall pick in the NFL draft. Those accolades are tough to argue with.
And 10-1.
10-1. Yeah. It's
That's
hard
to me, that's an important stat.
Yes. A very good quarterback for the Terps. He only played the 1 year. He backed up Jack Scarbath for those first 2 years, but he's our number 3 quarterback. And then we'll go on to our underrated quarterback, the guy who played under you, coach, in 2002, 2003, 21-6 as a starter, a great record, especially considering the other records Maryland's had since the 80s or the mid 80s, really. But he was a 2-time bowl game MVP. There's only been a couple guys do that. The 2002 Peach Bowl, 2003 Gator Bowl. He's 6th all-time in passing yards at Maryland, 5th all-time in TDs. You don't think of him when you think of the greatest quarterbacks, but he ranks high in the stats. He's got the victories, like you said, 21-6, and won the MVPs.
What's amazing about that also is, the first game he played we played in the preseason game against Notre Dame in the up in New Jersey. And then we had Florida State, I think, the third game, and we lost both of those games. And Scott didn't play particularly well in there because, he was coming into a new system. We had to teach him how to read coverages, which he didn't do in high school or at West Virginia. And then we got him kind of going on a run with Charlie Taft. I remember going up to West Virginia, and of course he was going back to play at the school he left. And I know it was a big game for him. I didn't let the press talk to him the whole time, but I sat with him for 5 hours going up to West Virginia I had a flip card, so I have a formation, a defense, and then I call a play, and then he's got to tell me what the coverage is on my flashcard. I go back and forth. And I think he wrote a book and said how embarrassed he was that the head coach sat with him for 5 hours when he was just trying to relax and listen to his music. But he played pretty well. We won the game pretty big. I think we scored 48 points, and he had a big game. So that got him going, his confidence, and then he only lost 4 games from that time, so he did pretty good.
Right. I remember that game, and I remember watching, and the announcer, I can't remember her name. She went to Maryland, and I remember her saying how she didn't think he was going to do well because of his sidearm release.
Yeah,
And then he went out and had that game. I can't remember her name. Someone will tell us. Someone in the when
I know
people watch the video, someone will tell us.
she's never been big on Maryland, so I didn't worry about her. But
Yeah.
he was a left-hander.
Yeah.
He had a strong arm. Ironically, Boomer was a left-hander, and they both wore number 7. And he was a very good magician with the football. He could fake real well. In fact, I was watching a tape of the West Virginia game for Football by Friedgen, which is coming out. And the announcer there said he reminded him a lot of Boomer the way he faked. But, Scott was a godsend to us. The fact that he transferred and walked on. I didn't have a scholarship for him. And Bill McGregor was the coach at DeMatha, and he called me, and I think Mike Loxley was recruiting him, and I told him sure he could walk on. Then I watched him on our scout team. I think it was like 2 or 3 weeks later, I called him in and told him I'd put him on scholarship after spring practice. And I knew he had a chance to be a real good quarterback.
Yeah. All right, let's look at some honorable mention quarterbacks now, players that we talked about that have a place in the history but didn't quite make our rankings. It's an alphabetical order, but I'm going to start at the bottom with Tulia Tagovailoa, the 4-year starter from Maryland who has all the records now, and by a lot. He has 11,256 yards. Milanovic is 4,000 yards behind him. It's going to be hard for somebody to break them. All the passing TDs. He's got all the records. And I would have had him 4th because of the records. He did get 2. He was a 2-time all-conference player as a second team. He was the pinstripe MVP. He's the all-time leading passer in Big Ten history. Those are a lot of accolades. It was just tough to compare him to the accolades when you have guys finishing in the top 4 of the Heisman. So I would have had him 4th, Coach.
Yeah. With the stats, I think he also has an extra year in there too, with the pandemic.
The COVID year, right?
So, but yeah, you can't argue. He's a good player. Played very well for Maryland. Again, winning is important too. And,
right.
But you can't argue with his stats. So
yeah, great player for the Terps the last 4 years, and hopefully the beginning of some longer term resurgence. We've got Stan Gelbaugh and Frank Reich in there, who you already mentioned came in when you came in. They were there. The funny thing about the NFL, the 5 NFL quarterbacks in the 80s, you think of as these great quarterbacks, none of them rank high in the statistics because they were all backing each other up. They'd get 2 seasons maybe, or 1.5, because there was 1 year where they kind of split because there was an injury between Gelbaugh and Frank Reich. But the quarterbacks in the 80s for the Maryland coach for the Terps.
Well, I think, Frank, Frank got hurt. We were 1-2, I think, his senior year, and then he came in against North Carolina and kind of finished up, and then came in against Miami and led the biggest comeback at that time in college football history, down
Right.
30-0 to defending national champs.
Yeah.
He came back and won the game in the second half, and then he did the same thing in the Sun Bowl. We were down 21-0 to Tennessee, and he brought us back, and we won that game 28, I think 28, 26 or 27, something like that. And then he went to the pros, and he had the biggest comeback in pro football when the Buffalo Bills beat the Houston Oilers, I think it was.
It was. Yep.
So Frank was a very, very good quarterback, and is a very, very good coach too. Stan Gelball has the unique distinction of being the quarterback. When the season started, we were number one ranked in the country.
Mm.
We lost a very controversial game to Penn State in our first game, and then I think we ended up losing 3 games that year. I think we lost to Penn State, Michigan, and Miami by a total. I think it was like 10 points.
Mm.
That was a pretty good football team there, and Stan was an excellent quarterback, and really we were very fortunate to come into that situation, and Coach Ross's offense, I think, really fitted those guys. And not only did we had an excellent offensive line, but we also had good running backs, good fullbacks, good wide receivers, and good quarterbacks. So we were very fortunate to have a very good offense.
Well, 3 back-to-back ACC championships are evidence of the talent. Sean Hill, coach, when you took over in 2001, he was there. Maybe, I think, probably my favorite season in Maryland history, because the 15 years prior, Maryland did not do well. Let's be honest about that. They had 1 bowl game in 15 years. Were not winning games. You came in and out of nowhere, seemingly, kind of turned it around, and Sean Hill was the quarterback of that team.
Well, Sean's going to be one of those guys. It's not, like I told one pro coach, it's not a beauty contest. Sean just wins. He's a winner. He's a tough kid. He could run the ball. He could throw the ball. He came up with big plays. I'm just watching an NC State game that we had a win, and the last drive, he got hit like unbelievable, hung in there, and led us to a conference championship. Really, the first time any team in the ACC won a championship other than Florida State after they joined. So he went on to pro football. I think he played like 15 years in pro football as a backup quarterback, but every time he got in, he had the best job in the world because he could win as a backup quarterback. Made a lot of money and didn't get beat up. So power to him.
Yes. Scott Milanovic, coach, is very similar to Talia in that he racked up a lot of stats in the 90s. He was there under Mark Duffner when they ran the run and shoot. And so there was an overemphasis on the passing game, racked up a lot of stats. They didn't win a lot, as you know, coach. He's second in a lot of the statistical categories now. He did get a first team all conference and a second team all conference. But we have him as an honorable mention here.
Well, I don't know a whole lot about him. I know I played against him
and beat him, right?
Actually, ironically enough, we had lost at Georgia Tech. We had lost 16 straight ACC games, and he was suspended. And there was, I think, a quarterback named Cummings was the starter, and Maryland was 3-0 with him.
Yeah,
and he became eligible for our game. They put him in, and I think we won the game 32-0 or something like that.
Oh,
it was the first ACC win we had in the big time, and then we went on a run and beat Clemson the next week. We were 30-point underdog, beat Clemson at Clemson, and went on to win 7 games, went 7-4, and didn't go to a bowl game. Beat Georgia, and they went to the Peach Bowl, and we didn't. But that was the only time I got to see Scott Milanovic. So.
Yeah, well, you have a history of beating the Terps, coach. We're not going to talk about that. We don't like that. When you coached at the other schools. Yes, we know you did that. All right, Dick Shiner, 1961 to 1963. He was a first-team all-conference and a second-team all-conference, 87th pick in the NFL draft. Great quarterback in the early 60s. He was before your time, right?
Well, I knew Dick. He actually was a coach for Bob Ward, but Dick was always around the program. But his his big claim to fame was at that time he was the only quarterback to beat Penn State at Penn State, and it
Yeah.
was a lot of years before we finally broke through and beat them again. But yeah, that Dick was and played for, I think played for the Redskins, played in the NFL. Yeah, he was a good quarterback.
And that'll do it for the quarterbacks. We're going to move on to the running backs now, and there's going to be two running backs on our first team. It was one quarterback, two running backs, two receivers, a tight end, five offensive linemen. That's how we did that. We're going to go on now to our running backs and our first team running backs, Lamont Jordan and Charlie Wysocki. We'll start with Lamont Jordan, coach, 1997 to 2000. He graduated before you played with him. He's all-time leader in rushing yards, 4,147. All-time leader in receiving yards for running back as well. I don't think people know that. 732, almost 5,000 yards from scrimmage, which is the most all-time in Maryland history, apart from quarterbacks. We don't not counting the passing yards. 37 total touchdowns. He was first team ACC in 1999, second team in 98 and 2000, the number 49 overall pick. For me, coach, the best running back in Maryland history, most decorated, most stats, all of that.
Very good player, very hard runner. Played against him when I was at Georgia Tech.
Yeah.
You know, I believe they were putting him up for the Heisman. He didn't win it, but again, you got to be on winning teams if you're going to win awards like that. So,
Yeah. Yeah, he wasn't up for the Heisman, but a great running back. And we talked about in the prep meetings I think it was the year before you came when Vanderlinden was there and Maryland had the lead against Virginia in the final minute, and Lamont Jordan ran for I think close to 300, maybe even over yards in the game. And Maryland, because of him, were going to be going to their first bowl game in about 10 years. But then the quarterback, I believe, was Latrez Harrison, coach, ran out of bounds when
thought it
Maryland
was
had
McCoy.
Calvin McCall, Latrez Harrison. Someone will correct us on that. McCall's the one who also played basketball. Yeah, one of those two, but whoever it was ran out of bounds, and Virginia got the ball back and scored a touchdown. And at the time, it was a very painful victory, but it was a blessing in disguise because it cost Vanderlinden his job, which led to you. Anyway, the point is Lamont Jordan almost single-handedly put Maryland back in the bowl game at that time. That's how good he was.
Yeah.
And the other player on the first team, Charlie Wysocki, played from 78 to 81. Did you have him at all when you came in, or did he leave before you got there?
He left just the year that we came in, but I knew Charlie and very hard
Yeah.
run. Of course, Coach Claiborne, that was his offense built around running the football, and
Yeah.
Charlie was a kid from Pennsylvania who did a great job of doing that.
Yeah, and he's second all-time in rushing yards, 26 rushing touchdowns, first team ACC, All-ACC in 79 and 80. That's our two first-team running backs. Second-team running backs, Rick Badonic and Bruce Perry. Rick Badonic, coach, ran for you when you were with Bobby Ross in the 80s. He was part of those ACC championship teams. He's the all-time leader in rushing touchdowns in Maryland history. He's got 44. He played 44 games, 44 touchdowns. That's insane. He also got two receiving touchdowns for a total of 46. That's the most in Maryland history, again, aside from quarterbacks with their passing touchdowns. He's fifth all-time in rushing yards, second all-time in receiving yards as a running back, so over 3,000 total yards from scrimmage. He was a Sun Bowl MVP in 84, number 186 pick in the draft, coach Rick Badonic.
He was a fullback, and we were very multiple. We ran the fullback a lot back in those days because we had two tailbacks that could block and run and catch. They were very well coached by Jim Kavanaugh, and Rick was. I don't think I coached 43 years. I don't think college or pro I ever met a guy in the red zone that could get the ball in the end zone. In fact, we would run 38, 39 toss, and he'd get it in somehow. I mean, it was unbelievable. He was built low to the ground and tough as nails, and really really a great football player and a great kid.
And then the other running back on our second team is Bruce Perry. Also played for you when you were a head coach. Got there just before you, but he was the seventh all time. He's seventh in Maryland all time in rushing yards, 2,424 yards. ACC Offensive Player of the Year, the last player in Maryland history to do that, by the way. In 2001, he was obviously the first all ACC first team in 2001, number 242 pick in the draft. What about Bruce Perry, coach?
Bruce is a really, really good running back. He got hurt a few times, which cost him some stats. In fact, in 2002, he had a groin pull, and we didn't get him to the sixth game. And he came back in and helped us win down the stretch. Very explosive, good good blocker, could catch the ball out of the backfield. Um, Mike Loxley did a great job of coaching him, and I was just very fortunate to come in with a lot of good players that really wanted to win, and I think Bruce was one of them.
Yeah, and he was also a slighter build, right, coach, but still played tough,
Yeah,
even
he
as
was.
a small.
He was probably 5'9", 5'10", about 200 pounds, 195 pounds. Physical kid.
Yeah,
I can remember, when I first got there, he wanted to run east-west a lot, and I kept talking to him. He had to go north-south, and I can remember the North Carolina game, the first game, and I saw him hit it up inside, and I went, "Wow, that was pretty, pretty incredible the way he hit it and exploded north-south." And I knew he would go on and have a great year, which he did. He loved playing against Wake Forest. I think he had 2 or 3 games he rushed over 200 yards each game against Wake Forest. But
they weren't that great that back then, but that
well,
North Carolina,
they ended up winning the conference one year when we were.
they did, yes. Who was
Yes,
the quarterback they had? Riley Skinner, I think it was his name,
that's
the
right.
Wake Forest quarterback. I remember. Anyway, yeah, but you mentioned that North Carolina game, coach, your first game, and I remember thinking watching it because North Carolina scored the touchdown on the very first was one of the very first plays, if not the first
The
70-yard
first play.
touchdown. And I was like, it was the first. I was like, oh God, here we go again. We have this new coach, same as the old coach. And obviously it ended up being much better than that. But I remember that first play.
You were
Everybody's like, oh
35,000 other people were thinking the
yeah,
same.
yeah, yeah.
Gary Blackley, my defensive coordinator, came on the phone and says, "Am I fired?" I said, "No, we got 59 more minutes. I'll let you know after that." So I
And it ended up being something like 28-7. They never scored again.
think it was
So
21-7. So
21-7. Yeah. So obviously he did a good job, and obviously the rest of the season was very good as well. Okay, let's move on to our third team, Ed Modulewski and Lewis Carter. Ed Modulewski, part of those great teams in the early 50s, late 40s under Coach Tatum. He was a second team All-American. He's seventh all-time in rushing touchdowns and 16th all-time in rushing yards in Maryland history. But you have to remember, again, many fewer games, fewer plays per game because pace of the game was very different back then. He was the number 6 pick in the NFL draft. That's how good he was.
yeah, I don't know a whole lot about him. I know the Modulewskis. I think one of either it's Ed or Mo, son played for Maryland also, and I coached him as a freshman. But I
Mm,
know both of the Modulewskis were really good football players, and he has the stats in the era that they won. So
yeah,
I think you have
Mar-
to.
yeah, Maryland's heyday. And then Lewis Carter in the 70s, coach, he was maybe you had him for a year or so when you were a graduate
I had him
assistant.
as a freshman. I was one of the
Okay,
first coaches when he was there.
okay.
Very, very good athlete. Very big. He was big, strong kid who could run. Physical runner. Good pass receiver. Good athlete. Uh, he's a good football player.
Yeah, and he's 11th all time in rushing yards, 6th all time in rushing TDs. Again, the statistics in the 70s are going to be smaller than what they are now. So we had to tried to consider that when the numbers are a little lower for those guys. But he was a two-time first team All ACC. So and the
Again,
number 76 pick in the draft, which is early third, maybe a mid third round pick. So obviously a very good player.
yeah, they won 3 ACC championships, and he was the primary ball carrier. So
Right, under Claiborne, three ACC championships. Okay, our underrated running back coach, Darrell Scott, who played for you from 2007 to 2010. You don't think about this guy when you think about when I'm looking through the stats, and he's 10th all time in rushing yards, 8th in total touchdowns. But more than that, he was a two-time bowl game MVP. I think only he and Scott McBrien are the only two I think in Maryland history to do that. Humanitarian Bowl in 2008, Military Bowl in 2010. 221st pick in the NFL draft, but as an underrated guy here, Coach.
I think he was a great breakaway guy. I'll bet if you go back and look at it, I think he probably had more long runs than any running back that Maryland's had. And I'm talking about 90 yarders, 70 yarders. He wasn't very, he's kind of slight build, probably about 6 foot, probably weighed about 180 pounds, 185. But he could run. He got a hole. He was going to go all the way. And he was a good pass receiver also. So he had a good career for us. He went and played for the Giants. I think he played a year or two. That's, I would think he'd have trouble blocking up there with his physique and whatnot.
Yeah. Well, a very underrated running back for the Terps. Now we're going to get into some honorable mention running backs. And I'm going to group a couple of these guys together that we added in, Dave Daddio and James Lynch, because you talked about Rick Badonic as a fullback, and all the statistical numbers are going to be dominated by the running backs. But there's some great fullbacks in Maryland history as well, unsung heroes, great blockers. Dave Daddio and James Lynch are two of those guys, Coach.
But Dave Daddio was a very good athlete. He was like 6'3", probably 225 pounds. He could run the ball. He could block. He could catch the ball. Very, very good player. And, he was there when we came in. So it was, we were very fortunate to have him. And then when I came in 2001, we had this fullback who was like, I don't know, 5'10", 270 pounds and probably could run a 4.6. He ran the inside veer against Florida State and took it 70 yards, and they didn't catch him. So anytime you run 70 yards at Florida State and you're 275 pounds and they don't catch you, and he could block. Now, Bruce Perry, he was the beneficiary of James Lynch.
Right.
Really good football player, and he could catch. And, it's a shame that we should have we wouldn't. I don't know if we'd have as many, but as many good running backs as they've had at Maryland, and it's quite a few. They've always probably had to have a good fullback in front of them, especially from the era in the 70s and 80s. Now a lot of times everything's one back, but
right.
But back then, those guys that ran the ball pretty good, they probably had a good fullback in front of them.
Yeah. Two other guys I want to group together, Alvin Blount and Tommy Neal, both 1983 to 86. They were part of those 3 back-to-back ACC championship teams when you coached under Bobby Ross.
And they were in the backfield with Badonic. Badonic was the fullback, and they were the 2 tailbacks. And again, if Badonic was running the ball, they were blocking. So they had to block, they had to catch, they had to do it. They had to be very well rounded. Tommy Neal was one of the toughest kids I've ever coached. He's a tough son of a gun. Alvin could run. Both of them were 4.5 or better. They could really fly, and they're both over 200 pounds. And I see Alvin quite, from time to time here down in South Carolina. Tommy Neal, I think, was coaching. I don't know what he's doing. Another guy we had that's up there is Willie Joyner, and he could be, the sleeper too. The
underrated player.
He was a really good player for us, and I remember we went down and played North Carolina in '82, I believe, and they had given up. This was after 6 games. They had only given up 80 yards rushing in 6 games, and he rushed for over 200 yards that day down in Chapel Hill. And he had a couple of long runs that day. And he was really a good running back for us.
One other player that could be considered as one of the underrated players, someone I didn't realize about his statistical history and his overall history with the Terps, is Steve Atkins, who played from 75 to 78 under Coach Claiborne. He's 3rd all-time in rushing yards in Maryland history, was a Gator Bowl MVP, and was drafted into the NFL. So another guy.
He was a big running back, a very physical kid, and I remember they went to the bowl game right after I left and went down to the Citadel, and my wife and I ended up going to the game. I believe they won. They beat Florida in the Gator Bowl, I believe, and then the next year they played in the Peach Bowl. I went to that one also. So I think they played Georgia in the Peach Bowl.
Yeah, Coach Claiborne, 7 bowls, tied with you for all-time lead in bowl games as a Maryland coach. As a little aside there, someone who's on the current team, the only player on the current team that'll be playing up in 20 this year in 2024. Roman Hemby, coach, is very interesting because he currently has 1,740 rushing yards and 648 receiving yards. He's third all time in receiving yards as a running back. He has a chance to get to 1,000 this year and be the first running back ever to do that. He has 2,388 yards from scrimmage. If he can duplicate his previous 2 seasons, maybe do a little better, he has a very good shot at being second all time in Maryland history, yards from scrimmage, excluding quarterbacks, coach.
I really like this kid. He's got a lot of explosive to him. I think he's made a lot of big runs for Mike, and I watched a YouTube thing on him. And I was very impressed with his family and his goals and just the way he handles himself. I believe that he'll have a great year this year, and will probably move up in the rankings. And we do this again. I look
Yeah.
forward to doing very well.
One last player in the honorable mentions is Ty Johnson. He's fourth all time in rushing yards and was drafted in the 6th round, I believe, in the NFL. Great running back for the Terps. Almost 3,000 yards from scrimmage, which puts him up in the rankings as well.
I like this guy. I liked him as a pro football player. He played with the Jets, and I think he's with Buffalo now. But
Yeah.
he's a good football player.
Yeah. That is going to do it for our quarterbacks and running backs, our first episode here for the Maryland all-time football team. Coach, before we leave, I want you to tell everybody how to find your YouTube channel.
It's on Instagram and it's on YouTube. It's Football by Friedgen. We have a first year up. What my daughter and I have done is we've taken 2 or 3, 4 games in a season that we think that were instrumental in our success, and I kind of go through the game and talk about the game and what was important in it. And now we're working on 2002. My daughter just bought a house and living down here, and she's working and taking care of her house. So I'm all caught up. I'm ready to go. She just got to come over here and make me look good when we do this thing. But
All right.
people seem to like it. Hopefully, people will enjoy it.
Well, we're going to put a link to that in our description. So everybody watching this, you can go follow Coach's YouTube channel when he goes through and does all. That's going to be really exciting to watch. We have 4 more episodes of this. Very excited about that. Can't wait to get through them all. And we will let you know when that's going to happen. Thank you very much, Coach. This is IMS Radio.